Audio test. Yeah, that's it. It's on.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Library of Mistakes. Good to see you here again. Things have changed a bit at the Library of Mistakes. We now have merchandise, as you may have noticed on the way through. And I'm going to ask my lovely assistant, David, to come to the front of the room. This is what you could be. This is what you could be going home with tonight. So next time you come, we will also have mugs as well. There are postcards and bookmarks, and if you're watching online, you can email us as well. Apart from that, we're also able to take donations. So we've never done that before, but if you feel like you'd like to make a donation on the way out, please do so. As ever, I like to begin by thanking our drink sponsors, Kennock's Asset Management. It's always good to be liquid. Not their phrase, mine, so thank you. And I will not be chairing tonight. We've got somebody else for that, because I was out with Bob this morning. We went to see our old friends, Adam Smith and David Hume. And while we were doing that, I said to Bob, kind of jokingly, I think you all know Bob's CV, have you ever had a bodyguard? To which he replied, yes, 9. 9 bodyguards. I've been trying to annoy people all my life. I've never gone above 2. You don't want them? Okay. So given that Bob is a real economist, we thought we'd get a real economist to chair and interview him. And that is Madeline of the Library of Mistakes, who lives here in Edinburgh and is with a fund management company in the Netherlands called Hofbos. Without further ado, I think I've covered everything I'm supposed to cover. I'm now your bodyguard, Bob. I'll be standing at the door. But don't worry, because I know where they live. Madeline, over to you.
Thank you, Russell. It's an honor to introduce to you tonight Dr. Bob Traa. Bob has worked for the IMF for 30 years, visiting 55 countries for economic reviews, from Brazil to Yugoslavia, and from Argentina to Greece during the Eurozone. He's written 5 books, the latest of which is The Macroeconomy of the European Union, a work in progress. And I would say that anyone who's interested in investing in stocks or bonds in the EU should read this book. I would like to start by reading a few paragraphs from the first page before handing it over to Bob. Prologue. This book derives the view that the European Union faces 4 interrelated challenges. The EU 27 underestimates the impact of internal demographics, leading to stress between member states, suffers from exaggerated growth expectations, optimism bias, runs fiscal policies that are unsustainable. The Maastricht criteria are not country-specific and are too loose given member countries' moderate potential growth. And the European Union is developing its institutions in a manner that is reactive to negative shocks instead of proactive to future risks. The EU needs to step ahead of the curve and aim for best practice in federalism. The concern is that of creeping cumulative institutional changes designed under duress that are drifting the EU toward a lowest common denominator, incrementally distorted innovations to bail out poor performance, a negative incentive now also prevalent in the ECB. Instead of demanding best practice, a positive incentive. Wow, Bob, that is quite something. I hope the EU policymakers are watching online tonight, and if not, they can do so afterwards. Over to you.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good. Thank you so much for inviting me. I have many friends, of course, economists and lawyers and all sorts of professionals in Washington, D.C., and the IMF and the World Bank and the IDB. And there's lots of places to exchange professional views. And they asked me when I told them I was going to the Netherlands to visit my family. I was born in the Netherlands. And then I made a side trip to Edinburgh. They asked me, well, you are retired now from the fund and you are going to, you write books. And that may be nice, but is anybody interested in your books? And I said, yes, the library of mistakes. And so they were kind of apprehensive what that means, that the library of mistakes is one of my biggest fans, and I see there are 2 of my books in this library. But indeed, I have known Madeleine. We actually started at the same university in the Netherlands. That's one link we have. And when she did an interview when I stepped down from the fund and published a piece in the alumni magazine, a very nice piece. And she discovered I was very interested in philosophy and Baruch Spinoza. And I said, I would love to see Adam Smith and David Hume. And she says, well, you have to come and talk at the Library of Mistakes, and then you can visit. So this is how I wind up here. It was very nice. But I wrote this book in the context of what is underway in the European Union right now. As you know, there's a Stability and Growth Pact, the SGP. This was all determined and begun in 1992 when there was a big meeting in Maastricht, which is a country in the south of the Netherlands, and they formulated the Treaty of Maastricht. And in the Treaty of Maastricht, they came to some agreement on convergence criteria for countries that were either in the Eurozone or wanted to become part of the Eurozone under common currency. And these economic criteria were deemed to be important so that countries didn't float apart and tear the European Union apart as a result. And the really iconic ones that everybody seems to know about is the Maastricht criteria, which are fiscal criteria. The 2 that are very well known are the deficit criterion, which says that you should aim to have a deficit of 3% of GDP or less. And the other one is a debt criterion, which is much more demanding, it turns out, in structural terms, and that is that your debt should not exceed 60% of GDP. And these 2 numbers are out there, and many people have heard of them, but not many people know how these numbers fit together and what they actually mean. And now, 30 years later, after the COVID epidemic and the Great Recession that was there in 2010, 2012, the European Union is reviewing and reforming these Maastricht criteria. We're 30 years on. This is a good idea. The implementation apparatus for these Maastricht criteria has become so complicated that the European Commission, which is a surveillance agency in the European Union to check on the countries on a continuous basis, also agrees that it is good to simplify, to look at these criteria. Again, the world has moved on. We have really different kind of problems, and we have different potential growth rates which influence how you pitch fiscal policy. So I think it's entirely a good idea. And by the way, the Maastricht criteria at present are suspended because of the COVID problems. And they are supposed to be reintroduced on January 2024. I doubt that this will happen because they're really not far along in agreeing politically how to reform the system. So in that context, I'm sitting at home in Washington, and I pick up the Financial Times, and I see this op-ed by Mario Draghi and Emmanuel Macron on December 23, 2021. And these were proposals from France and Italy jointly to reform the Maastricht criteria. And as I read this, I kind of fell off my chair. I thought it was so odd. I could make no heads or tails out of what they were trying to do because I thought it was a terrible op-ed. It was extremely self-serving. In other words, you take big parts of the debt from France and Italy and shove them into the European federal agency so that we get this off our balance sheet and then we can start spending again. It read in a simplistic way like that. There were bifurcated golden rules, which is a golden rule means you can only borrow for investments, for capital building. There were different definitions of primary balances. There was fast debt and slow debt. I had never heard of fast debt and slow debt. Short-dated debt, yes, and longer-dated debt, but fast and slow debt was new to me. So this worried me because these are heavyweights, of course. This is the top of the European Union. And if they write an op-ed in the Financial Times and people cannot make sense of it, what this means, this is just an erosion of trust. And I can tell you one thing from my experience of working in the IMF for 33 years. If the public loses trust in the political system, you're toast. You cannot run policies in a country that has lost all trust in the political system. So since these are absolute heavyweights, I mean, this is the core of the European Union. Germany, of course, is another one, and the Netherlands is not a small player, but it's much smaller. Spain is a sizable country. If these two get together and decide that they're going to ventilate plans that, in my view, make absolutely no sense whatsoever, this is strange. So I pondered this op-ed for a long time, and I really couldn't understand what they were doing until the only hypothesis that was left, I did a Cartesian exercise where I stripped away everything that I wasn't really certain about, and then there was only one thing left over at the end, and that is quite startling, actually, and something that they cannot and will not say outright. And that is that, in my view, this op-ed on paper in the Financial Times says France and Italy cannot comply with the Maastricht criteria, and we will not do it. So give us some gimmicks so that we pretend, which is very European, that we pretend as though we make these Maastricht criteria, but really the truth is we cannot do it and we will not do it. And it's not an economic problem, it's a political problem. France and Italy have serious political problems, and they would know much better than we do. They can't muster the political coherence to take the kinds of measures, which are undoubtedly difficult, because France is now at 115% of GDP in debt and rising, and Italy is at 130, 135, and Greece is, of course, at 170. I mean, this is undoable to expect them to go to 60 within a reasonable period of time. So I think, these are such experienced people in their own political systems. They know whether they can do it or not. And in my view, they have really declared openly that, colleagues in the European Union, we cannot do this. And if you put that in your pipe and smoke it, that is important, because the European Union really hangs together of these countries cooperating and solving these problems in one way or the other. So that, to me, was extremely important. And then the question came, well, you cannot just criticize or think strange things as important people like this write op-eds. What is the positive approach? How would you go about analyzing this problem? What are the options for the European Union if some countries really cannot raise the revenues or cut the expenditures to gradually drift down to 60% or below? So that then became a positive exercise, and that is where I really wrote this book. And when I do a macroeconomic analysis, I always begin with demographics, because population movements, and I should also say I'm not an economist that is overly concerned or preoccupied by short-term cycles. I think of structure, and I think of very long-term scenarios that tell me what kind of risks may be lurking underneath the surface, because you can only get a feeling for that when you do very long-term scenarios. And scenarios are not forecasts. Scenarios are devices that will teach you what variables are really important that you have to watch if you are concerned about various risks in the economy. So I go to Eurostat, and they have a wonderful database on demographics, and this is what they showed me. And what it means is that we are now at a peak in Europe. The population is peaking. And going forward, the baseline, which is the most likely outcome, is a decline of the population to, where are we, below 420 million. And that is a decline of about 0.1% per year. So the overall population on the most likely scenario in Europe is going to shrink. The population is getting smaller. But these things are never certain. There are all sorts of confidence intervals around it. And the demographers tell us that the most sensitive variable on the downside that could really drop the population is the fertility rate. Fertility rates are dropping all over the world. And I have a whole chapter on what may be behind this. This is really quite fascinating literature. And they said if the fertility rate keeps declining, then we get this low scenario where the population kind of collapses to 320 million people by 2100. Now, this dynamic would really wreak havoc on the European economy because this is a very sharp decline. This is serious business. And the upside potential in the European Union, and by the way, this is for the composite economy of all 27 European countries. I've also done this for each country individually, and the book has tables where you see every country and then the total. I'm presenting only the total. The upside potential is if we just open the borders and everybody can come in that wants to come in. This is the immigration scenario. But this is, of course, unlikely to happen because immigration is also very straining on socio-political systems. But even at the upside scenario, the population will kind of stabilize, and I don't think it's likely to happen. And here you see the growth rates. My vertical line is today. The line on the left is the growth rates of the population in the past, and then on the right-hand side we have the growth rate of the population in the future. Now I ask you intuitively, when you think of growth rates of real GDP, growth rates of an economy, do you think the economy is going to speed up as we go to the right-hand side into the future, or it's going to slow down? And I would say, if you have this demographic drag, the economy is going to grow more slowly. That has important implications for how you structure fiscal policy. The average on the right-hand side is minus 0.1 per year. The average on the left-hand side in the past was plus 0.4% a year. And it's a declining function, obviously. But a difference of 0.5% per year in population, that is going to make a difference in terms of what you can do realistically with your economy. Now, so the first part of the book is all demographics, and it's almost 100 pages. I talk a lot about people moving within the European Union, which I also found out is very interesting. The eastern border, the eastern countries, and the southern countries are losing people very quickly within the EU, and they're moving to the northwest. So I'm very familiar with Greece because I live there, and I'm familiar with the Netherlands, and these are on the opposite ends of the diagonal. So I was sensitive to picking up this information that people are moving from the southeast and going to the northwest. If you go to Amsterdam, you'll hardly be able to find a residence because there's so many people coming to the Netherlands, and they're coming from the east and they're coming from the south. Now they're coming from Ukraine, obviously, but that's a shock. That's an unusual event. Now, part B, out of this demographic profile, because also within the existing population, more and more people get older, so the age distribution is also shifting. That's an additional slowing factor for potential growth. Now, part B is what I call the calculation of the macroeconomic framework. The macroeconomic framework is a combination of key variables such as real GDP and real GDP growth, inflation, which you see on the right-hand side there. What does the GDP deflator do? That's, of course, determined by the ECB. Nominal growth is essential to know for fiscal analysis, and it contains labor market analysis. This is all part of what we call a macro framework. And if you want to do monetary or fiscal or structural policy, you need to have a view on the macro framework. What do you think the economy can deliver? How fast can this economy grow? If you don't know this, you really can't calibrate policy. So that would be very dangerous. It's just a hit and miss exercise. And here we see some of these results. I mentioned to you that in the past, the population grew by 0.4% on average. And in the future, this is going to fall. Then the working age population, the WAP, as a percentage of the total population is declining. And this is everywhere, because we have cohorts shifting towards elderly people. And we have very few younger people coming in. So the part of the population that is really able to work is shrinking relative to the overall population. And this is You can devise other statistics such as dependency ratios, and if you care about your pension and you have a pay-as-you-go system in your country, you really want to watch this variable because there are fewer and fewer workers that pay into the system to afford your pension. So this is a critical variable, it's going down. Now, participation rates are going up in almost all countries because governments realize that we have fewer people working, so we try to bring in as many people as possible. Women have tremendous run-up in participation rates, but we also bring in elderly people by shifting the retirement ages up. You know, remember Mr. Macron, he has to govern France. These poor guys, if they have to work past 62, they're going to die. So, you know, his problems are serious ones. I thought this op-ed was crazy, to be honest with you, but I understand his pain because he has to manage this country. And this country is not politically cohesive. France is one of the most difficult political countries to manage. And Italy is also very complicated. And in Italy, the participation rate is the lowest of the European Union. Then we have the unemployment rate. You need to calibrate your scenarios on the basis of what we call the natural rate of unemployment. In a steady state, the unemployment rate is going to drift to a natural number that depends on structural policies and labor market arrangements and regulations. So it used to be 9.4 for the EU 27 in the past, average. This is a very high number. And the EU is, of course, realizing that you cannot continue like this. You need to bring people into the labor process, improve matching, jobs matching, etc. So I dropped it down to 6.2. Anyone can change this number, but it has implications for how fast economies can grow and how big they can get. If you get a lower unemployment rate, more people will be working, you will have a higher GDP, and that helps you to carry pension obligations, health obligations, etc. Then on the right-hand side, if up there, that equation, if output, Q, which is real GDP, is the product of two things, and this is an identity, as you see, you can scratch L against L, and then it just says Q is Q. So this is a Platonic form. This is not a shadow. This is a mathematical identity. That means it's always and everywhere, under any circumstances, correct. I had people ask me, this equation must be correct because in your production function there's no investment, so what's going on? And I told them, well, I can write Q over L, which is average labor productivity, differently from a Cobb-Douglas production function or a constant elasticity of substitution function, and then you will see how capital comes in. But this is just a different way of writing this. This is an identity is always right. What that means is that if you want to predict or make a scenario of how fast the economy can grow, then you have to analyze labor, which is the number of people working, which is fundamentally a demographic variable, and it's declining. There's a demographic anchor pulling down the availability of labor in the European Union. And productivity is a very complicated variable, but what we have seen in the past is that productivity is gradually declining. And this has a flavor of diminishing marginal returns. Once you're already rich and you have introduced all the technology, it becomes very difficult to speed this up even further unless you have some miraculous technological innovation. In the early 90s, when the Maastricht criteria were made, we had the computers really fully on stream, and there was a productivity uptick. And that has influenced how the original version of the Maastricht criteria were formulated, as we will see in a minute. So what do we get out of this? Real GDP with labor in the past growing at 0.6% per year on average. This is employment. And productivity on average being 0.9 gave us an average economy for all the EU 27 economies 1.6. In the future, in this baseline scenario, I think that the numbers, this is not something you want, you just let the data tell you what's going on. The employment is likely to shrink by 0.2. I have picked productivity growth at 0.9, which is not pessimistic, because remember the 0.9 that's sitting there is an average, higher in the beginning and lower later. Most recently, this was around 0.7 and 0.6. So I'm picking it up a little bit and holding it steady at 0.9. And that gets me then a potential output growth under baseline for a very long period on average of 3/4 of a percentage point. Now that's a very large decline in real GDP growth. This is a substantial decline in real GDP growth. We need a deflator to get to nominal GDP. So in the past, the ECB has delivered 1 3/4% inflation, which is in accordance with the monetary target, which is below but close to 2%. To me, the ECB has done a good job in the past. It's now lost its anchor, I believe, but it did well. In the future, I'm picking 2 because that is the standard that everybody picks, because 2% is the inflation target. So you have to respect that the ECB is going to deliver this. What we get then is nominal GDP, and this, I'll show you why these numbers are important, was 3.3% in the past, and in the future, I think it's going to be 2.8%. Now, think of these numbers for real and nominal GDP, and I'm going to show you how this works. The European Commission, my colleagues, they do exactly the same kind of work that I do. And what you see here is, in my book, my baseline is the bold black line. This is the level of real GDP in constant prices. And then by 2100, through this mechanism, I get to about 23 trillion euros as the size, the absolute size of the real economy in the European Union. If I stretch all my assumptions favorably, I give it a favorable swing, every step that I made, population, working age, participation, unemployment, every step I pick a positive development, which nature never allows, right? This is a random process. If you make everything positive, then I get this dotted line in the middle, and that gives me about 32 trillion. That's the absolute highest that I think reasonably, as an experienced economist, that the EU can deliver. What do I read in the European Commission baseline? And they call it the baseline. This dashed line that sits on the top there, going to 40 trillion. Now that is quite a stunning line, because this means that the economy in Europe has a potential that just keeps on booming going forward. And this is, to me, counterintuitive if I think of the demographic anchor that's operating, and if I know we're going to have resource scarcity, it's already happening, we're going to have to worry about the environment, that requires spending money on the environment. And I couldn't figure out how on earth did they get this massive economy that is going there in the future. And I call it the optimism bias because my diagnosis of the problem that I see in the European Commission, and this European Commission is the surveillance authority in Europe. All the member countries look to them for guidance. But I think they have an optimism bias in the style of Daniel Kahneman, who you may know. He wrote a magnificent book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And he discusses the optimism bias because this is very common. If you have skin in the game, this is for private entrepreneurs and the same for governments, then you tend to minimize your concerns about possible problems. You root for the home team, so you say, oh, it's going to be okay. And that introduces an optimism bias. But an optimism bias is a source of risk, because then you are most likely not to make it. And if you don't make it in a political system, then everybody's going to kick you in the shins and say, well, you guys are hopeless. I mean, even though you may have delivered really a very respectable result, since you didn't meet your objectives, you're going to be accused of being amateurs and worse things. So optimism bias is a serious risk that occurs in political systems, and I have seen this in many governments. Particularly ministries of finance, where the minister is a politician, he wants to tell the public we're going to be okay. Optimism bias in almost every country is rampant. The central banks tend to be more cautious. Central banks also suffer from this political incentive mechanism, but a little bit less so in my personal experience. And they're not directly exposed to the voters. The minister is, but the governor often is not. So here is the difference between what I computed in my book and what the European Commission proposes. The employment growth, the demographics are exactly the same, identical, because we use the same demographers to give us our data. The big difference is in productivity growth. Look at what the EU Commission assumes. and this is from 2000 to 2021, this is the euro existence period, productivity was 0.7 on average. I left it to 0.9 because there were a few big shocks. Hopefully they will not persist and they can lift productivity growth. But the European Commission has this thing booming to 1.6% a year. If you've ever done this work, this is a very big number. You know, emerging countries, poor countries, I always have a rule of thumb. I talk to the minister and I tell him, if you can do 1.5% growth per year, average, you're going to be okay. That is a good number. And that's for poor countries with enormous potential. This is in a rich continent, one of the richest, with a declining population and an elderly population. And the Commission presents this number that its productivity is going to more than double. It's like 127% increase in productivity going forward. I just don't believe it. I hope this happens, but I think this is a big risk factor in the way that the European Commission does this work. And where does it come from? Well, they are very honest, and this I applaud. In the report, and this is described in the aging report, they describe an aspirational assumption. And this is the political cheerleading that is very common in every country and is also much alive in the European Union, because we all want the European Union to do well. So what do they say? The long-run projection is based on a central assumption of convergence, this is the critical word, of all member states towards the same value of labor productivity by the end of the projection horizon. So in Europe, one of the true and credible, honest objectives is that you have differences between countries. Some countries are extraordinarily wealthy and have high standard of living, and others are less so. So what do? They ask the richest countries to put money in a pot, and these are called structural funds, and then they lend them to the poorer countries so that they can develop their economy and catch up. This is the catching up story of all the countries that have, say, below average GDP per capita. There's a lot of effort going into structural reforms and in using structural funds from the European Union to help them. And what they do is they actually bootstrap their projection, because they are assuming that by 2070, which is the end point of their calculations, all these countries have converged to a productivity level that is much higher as where they are now. And they're not drawing down the best performing countries, they're bringing up all the weaker performing countries. So imagine this, if you have 27 countries and you all pull them up to the best performer by 2070, that's called a bootstrap in econometrics. You are predetermining that this thing is going to grow like bonkers, because these countries that are behind need to generate higher productivity growth than even the best performers to catch up. And 2070 is only 50 years from now. This process takes much longer. So I think there's a systematic optimism bias here that is going to create problems. And what I already see, if you take a country like Greece, they look at the scenario by the European Commission and they say, thank you very much, we take it. This is such a good forecast. Our own internal forecast may not be this good, because we also have political problems and high debt. So they love it. And since this is all approved by the whole membership of the EU, a country like Greece, I'm using Greece as an example, but there are many others, could take this forecast and say, we're going to grow out of the debt problem because we're going to accelerate. That's what the Commission is really telling us. So we can place debt to invest, and then by 2070, according to this mechanism, we're going to have much lower debt ratio because we grow out of it. Well, what happens, of course, is that the debt will come, but the growth will not come. That is the bad part of this optimism bias, because you're setting up the system for failure. And this, I have seen this happen over and over again. But at least they're honest, that they tell us explicitly that they've bootstrapped the scenarios. So I believe that the European Commission has way too optimistic forecast that is going to lead to trouble, because countries say, well, we don't have anything to worry about. We can just place all this debt. Now we need to switch to fiscal analysis. How does fiscal analysis graft onto this sense that you have of the macro framework, of what the economy can potentially deliver? How fast can we grow? How big does this GDP become? And there we begin with the debt ratio, which is very simple. D, which is the ratio between bonds. Bonds stands for the Maastricht debt, divided by nominal GDP. That is the 60% is the objective for that number D. Now, if you do a total differential of this thing, and I won't bother you with this, but it's in the book, it's not so complicated. It's called an Euler equation by a famous Swiss mathematician. Then you can show that if, say, the deficit every year is 3%, and the growth rate of the economy is an average number of 5%, then the debt ratio, it turns out, is an asymptotic function. It slowly creeps up to a certain level and then stabilizes there. And that asymptotic level is determined by the ratio between the deficit divided by the nominal growth rate. And that's why I showed you the nominal growth. We'll see in the next slide how this works. So the Maastricht criteria, you see the 60%, you see the deficit. What you may not have realized is that they assumed 5% nominal growth, because 3 divided by 5 is 0.6. That's the 60%. If countries were to maintain a 3% deficit and they grow at 5%, the debt ratios of every country in the EU, if they do this, would asymptotically approach 60%. If you are from below, it's asymptote that approaches from below. If you are above, it's an asymptote that approaches from above. But this nominal growth number, 5%, was made in the early 90s. In the early 90s, the 2% inflation objective was already there. So implicitly, they thought economies in Europe, all of them, could grow by 3% in real terms. And in the early 90s, when the productivity boom was underway with computers and digitization, well, that may have been a stretch, but it was not crazy. But now we're 30 years later, and what we have seen in the past is that the average nominal growth rate was 3.3%. They didn't make the 5%. Exactly what I predicted with this optimism bias. You see, the optimism bias was already there in 1992. And the average deficits, and there I think the Maastricht criteria have made a contribution, because they were kept below 3%, at 2.9%. If you divide these two numbers, then you get a debt ratio of 88.1% by this formula. So I go to Eurostat, and what do they report for the debt ratio? 88%, that's pretty close. So this formula is remarkably good at telling you what kind of debt ratio this system is gravitating towards. And obviously 88.1 is much higher than 60, because we're talking average for the entire Union. This is a big deviation. And already, what I mentioned, if you have an optimism bias, you're likely going to miss it, and you're missing it at the bad side, because the debt is much higher than what they had hoped for. Now with this in mind, let's go to the future. This is the average growth rate in the past, 3.3. This is the average growth rate in the future, 2.8. And you see this little dip here, that comes the baby boomers dying out. The next few decades are going to be difficult. And then the system stabilizes later on. The year-to-year dynamics can also be computed from this. So in the future, if it is true that growth, nominal growth, is 2.8%, and I want to keep my debt ratio to 60, in the discussions so far of reforming the Maastricht criteria, the countries have agreed, from what I understand, that we're going to keep the 60% objective. So they keep the D at 60%. But growth, in my view, will decline to 2.8. What that means is that your maximum deficit that you can afford is not 3%, but 1.7. And that's what I mean by saying, if you want to reform the Maastricht criteria, because the situation has changed and because we are getting older and we're slowing down, the Maastricht deficit needs to come down. It's not that you have more space, you have less space for this system to be consistent. And it's not something that we want. You just can't mess with mathematics, because mathematics is a law of nature. I can't change mathematics. So if we grow slower, we need to have tighter budgets. This is really what this means mathematically. And we can calculate what the maximum should be. And I do this for every country, because every country has a different, slightly different potential growth rate. So all the countries have their own implicit Maastricht criterion for the deficit. That is all benchmarked on going to 60, but they all grow at a slightly different potential rate. So they all have their own Maastricht deficit criterion, and that's interesting. And they are all below 3%. Even the fastest growing is below 3%. And the slowest growing, which is Italy, that maximum tolerable deficit is 1.1%. So the Italian authorities need to tighten the screws on the budget until they deliver, on average, maximum 1.1% deficits. Otherwise, there's no chance that they will ever get to 60%. And this is one of the reasons why Messieurs Macron and Draghi, of course, know all of this business. They are economists, calculate this for them. They are kind of saying, you know, we cannot do this. I don't see that we have the political cohesion to pull this off. So, and this is why I conclude in my book that if you want to make this reform, you're going to have some hard discussions, because it's not going to get easier, it's going to get more difficult in the future. Possible ways to make this consistent. Well, if you want to stick to the 3%, and the economy grows at 2.8, then your debt ratio, the asymptote, is going to gravitate to 107% on average for the European Union. If you're comfortable with that, be my guest. I don't think this is a stable business. You get a little shock at 107% baseline debt. The financial markets are going to leave you alone, and then you get a crisis. This is how crises come. They take decades in the making, and they emerge overnight, because you're setting yourself up extremely vulnerable position to get a shock if you do this. If you stick to 3% and you don't grow fast, your debt ratio just keeps going up. This is what Macron and Draghi propose. We'll just exclude some expenditures from these calculations. But this is fooling yourself. This is just a joke. This is the gimmick that I was talking about. You know, give us some gimmicks so that we pretend that we make this. But nature isn't impressed by somebody excluding a number from the statistics, of course. So you should never do this. But actually, you know, sadly, they propose this. You can also do a Hamiltonian. Alexander Hamilton in the United States, when the 13 colonies won the War of Independence against King George, they all had tremendous debts, and they were very different among the colonies. So Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary Treasury of the federal government in the United States, he said, I absorb all the debts from all the countries, so all the states, start with a clean base, but then I need a tax base, and the federal government in the US has income tax. The tax base was necessary to finance, to service this debt. So that was, this move by Alexander Hamilton really was clever in those days, and removed a major obstacle to starting the United States as a country. Now, Draghi and Macron want to do something similar. They want to take that debt that they already had and then just shove it into a fund in the European Union at the federal level. And then they say, well, we have less debt now, so we can spend for the children, you know. We have the digital economy and the green economy, and we have the elderly. But this is, again, a joke, because this debt hasn't disappeared. It's just sitting at the federal level now. And then the federal level needs a tax base to service this debt. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So again, this is, to me, is a very odd proposal, what they are saying there. Now, the last one, this is a very interesting one, comes from a French economist, Olivier Blanchard. Olivier Blanchard is a fabulous economist, a really top-notch professor at MIT, advisor to Macron, and a friend of Christine Lagarde, who's in the central bank now. And he said, look, if we want to stick with 60 and 3, we need to engineer nominal growth of 5. If our economy slow down to 1, as an example, then we need to double the inflation target to 4, because 1% real growth and 4% inflation gets us back to 5, and we solve this problem of inconsistency in the Maastricht criteria. Well, this is very clever, but I'm sure, Mr. Blanchard, I am not afraid of 4%, because I have real assets. I have indexed financial instruments. I have a sense that I know how to manipulate and manage this kind of situation. But if you are a median income earner and below, these people live in the cash economy and they have no indexed instruments. They pay the inflation tax because this is an inflation tax. Inflation is a tax. It's a real tax. It's just a wonderful one because the politicians are no longer responsible. You just ask the central bank to punch up inflation on average forever to close this gap. And to me, it is extremely clever of Mr. Blanchard to do this, but he's, of course, a Frenchman. He worries about France. Madame Lagarde is in the ECB. The ECB is doing very odd stuff. And what do we see? Well, inflation has now come off 10. It's now, what is it now, 8, 9, something like that. So maybe through the back door, they are actually loosening the inflation anchor in the European Union to try and help close this gap in the Maastricht criteria. And I think some countries are going to have major difficulties with the idea that you double the inflation target. But if the system becomes completely dominated by fiscal policy, in other words, the countries cannot do it, then at the end of the day, I guarantee you it's going to be solved through inflation. We're just going to print, and we're buying up all these bonds, and then we have inflation. That is the way all countries work that go through these processes. So I think this is what I wanted to, considerations, yeah. So one size doesn't fit all. All these countries have different growth rates. They have different starting positions for debt. I recommend that we look at them one by one and see what is the appropriate Maastricht deficit criterion per country. Then there's always a lot to do about sovereignty. You know, I worked for the IMF, and then we imposed conditionality on Greece and other countries. And the minister would always tell me, well, you can't do that because we're a sovereign country. And let's respect that they are all sovereign countries. But then if you're a sovereign country, you have to pay your own bills. Don't go to the European Union to bail you out. Because if you take risk and sit on a hot stove, then you're going to have to sit on the blisters, not somebody else. That seems to me not correct. You cannot have it, on the one hand, to be a sovereign state, and then on the other hand, if your plans don't work out well, then you shift your debt to the center, where the Germans and the Dutch and the Finns and the Danes and everybody pays to service this debt. So this is actually a no bailout mechanism. So we need to isolate stress. If countries say, we are sovereign countries, we run our own shop, I say, good for you, do this, but then we need to isolate problems if they come and not have spillovers to other countries in the Union. This is really where the Union has drifted away, because the origin of the European Union is no bailout. And then came Greece and we bailed them out. And then came Italy, and then Mr. Draghi, who was in the ECB, bailed them out. And then came France, and Madame Lagarde bails them out. So it's one bailout after the other. This thing has deteriorated in my view. We need to get back to a no bailout. One of the steps that you probably need to do is close the banking sovereign doom loop, which means that if a country has enormous amounts of debt and they push this debt into the banks, if they default, your whole banking system goes up. And that is a famous problem of banking crises, that the sovereign blows up banks. And then the taxpayers have to bail out the banks. This is a critical, classical pattern of banking crises. So you need to close that, and there are ways to do it by asking them to hold more capital when sovereign countries go bad or get higher spreads. What has Madame Lagarde done? She has created an instrument that if the spread of a country goes up, she can intervene and push it down. Well, that's a distortion of a market signal. It's precisely the opposite of what you should do in my world. But that's, again, a bailout facility. The other one, which is very harsh, and the Europeans don't want to do this, you can isolate the effects of countries, shocks, by having an exchange rate that is able to move. But of course, the euro is also a political project. It has benefits, undoubtedly, for commerce within Europe, and they really don't want to do that. You may get it through a crisis. that we have 2 euros, and some people are explicitly talking about this. We have countries that have difficulty with debt control. We give them 1 euro, the soft euro. And then we have countries that are very tight, and we give them the hard euro. And then these 2 euros can equilibrate the system and protect the various players. So my concern, after seeing this op-ed and working through the mechanisms of how the Maastricht criteria work, is really that I am afraid that the EU is slowly but surely drifting towards a bailout union. And that cannot possibly go well. Because there will be countries who then say, we want out. We are not going to be responsible for debts that are originated in other countries that tell us that they have political difficulties to come to an agreement. Well, it's not easy for us either. It's not a picnic for the Netherlands or Germany to have very low deficits. There's real work at work there. If France and Italy can't do it, well, then they should absorb the consequences of their own actions, I think. Otherwise, you can't hold this club together. So this is the essence of the analysis. And I've written this down in the book, and there are many corollaries and wrinkles and colors and flavors that sit all around these concepts that you, if you're interested, you can read it. And if you see something that you think, this is crazy, he missed something, you send me an email and you let me know. I think we should keep some time for questions. Huh?
Yes, thank you very much, Bob. That was fascinating. Before we open it up for questions, I would like to ask you, one reason that is often mentioned for taking on additional debt are the investments we need to make to have the transition to a more sustainable economy. How do you view that?
Yeah. So, Messieurs Macron and Draghi also say this, that we need a lot of money for green investments. Now, think about real GDP growth and the level of GDP that determines from a fiscal side how much debt you can carry and how big your deficits every year can be, because these are mathematically related. Now, if you invest in a classical sense in a new factory, then you know in the future you're going to produce more real GDP because this factory is a capacity expanding instrument. And that is why these investments you can actually fund, at least in part, with debt. Because in the future, when you have this capacity expanding investment, you have a bigger economy, and that generates more resources to service the debt on time. Now, what happens if you have a toxic waste dump in your town, here in the backyard of your town, and the kids are getting cancer, and this has now become an environmental hazard, and the mayor decides we have to clean this thing up because we can't let it sit there. Nature is killing us. We did it ourselves. But to me, this is not an investment. Every politician will tell you we need to invest, and they use this word, in the green economy. Why? They don't want to pay for it. They want to put that on the credit card for the next generation. But think of what this operation is. Is this investment that is going to expand capacity in the future to generate more GDP? I have my doubts. I think this is a delayed operating expense because you haven't cleaned up the dirt of your industry before, and now this is no longer possible to postpone. So you have to pay this out of current resources now. You are not generating with a critical probability a much bigger GDP in the future. You're staying alive, so you have to do this. But this is not a GDP accelerating type of activity. You have to pay for it. You can't borrow unless you just let the debt increase. But you know, young generations, this is very fascinating. They worry about their future, and the existing people who are in power, they worry about their assets. This is a different perspective. So there is a generational problem, stress. If you talk to Greta Thunberg, well, she's not an economist, but her instincts are very good. That you cannot just continue like this and call these things investment and just further increase the debt on top of what already exists. And the last thing I would say is that we suffer from, this is the economics profession that needs to change, we suffer from very incomplete balance sheets. Because in the past, when we had industry and we produced Q, real GDP, we actually also produced many other things that we never counted. Because the pollution and the dirt and the toxins that we spewed out in the process of producing Q, let's say Q is automobiles. This was never recorded on the balance sheet as a liability, that at some point you're going to have to clean this up. So because we have incomplete balance sheets, the debt that new generations are looking at that is on the balance sheet is only a portion of the total liabilities that new generations confront. And that is why young generations are very concerned that, again, this will simply be papered over with new debt, and they are going to have to incur all this, not only the existing debt, but also the environmental debt. And I think for young people, this is critical to understand, and I think their instincts are actually correct.
Thank you, Bob. And with that, I'd like to open it up for questions.
It's the keeper's prerogative to ask the first question.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about capital controls in the context of this, and it's probably on the exchange rate point. So I lived in Asia during the crisis. The IMF arrived in Asia. No capital controls.
Right.
One country imposed them, Malaysia, but the IMF wasn't involved. We now have two crises in Europe, Greece and Cyprus, and I think it was the second Greek crisis, not when you were there. Capital controls.
Yes.
Cyprus, capital controls.
Yeah.
We have a book in here by the central bank governor of Cyprus, Panikov Dimitriadis, says that the decision to impose capital controls was really the European Commission. Mm-hmm. The IMF agreed reluctantly. The ECB was against it. It is into this considerations and exchange rates, and I agree with you on inflation. But are we likely to see more of those to try and contain these problems? These were two small countries with debt, very big relative to GDP.
Yeah.
One couldn't even consider this happening in France and Italy. Are those temporary to less temporary capital controls part of the toolkit that you can see developing for the Eurozone?
Well, if the crisis comes, even for the big countries, they will get very creative. They will do financial repression. In other words, they'll force some funds and some banks to eat paper at below market interest rates. This is another way of making payments meet. Capital controls in both Greece and Cyprus were used to gain time. They're not structurally possible because the public finds a way around it. And you will, if you impose a capital control, in some countries do actually do financial taxes. And what happens then is nothing comes in anymore. So it bites them right back. All the capital goes out the country. If you then impose capital controls, it goes out through over-invoicing or under-invoicing of exports and imports. So capital controls don't work in a structural sense. But when a country needs to meet certain payments in an absolute crisis, they will prioritize and they will make some payments and they will run arrears or they will impose capital controls on other payments. In the case of Greece, it was deposits, that people couldn't go to the bank and take their deposits. In Lebanon, this is now a very major problem. So I think even big countries, the Brazil and Argentinas of this world, I have seen playing around with capital controls and restrictions in the financial system to kind of be able to bridge towards a time that they could breathe again. But it's not a structural solution. I have no doubt that very smart economists and financial engineers and Goldman Sachs is going to propose all sorts of wonderful plans to do this, and this is all very well. And then 5 years later, this blows up and it comes back. Plus very high interest. We've seen that in Greece and Italy as well. Mr. Draghi, of course, was from the stable of Goldman Sachs, and when I read this editorial, I thought, boy, he's still in it.
Well, quite a few of the books in this library have the words Goldman and Sachs.
Yes,
in them, so.
yes.
Do we have questions for Bob? Yep.
My question is, well, I'm glad I had a drink before I came out today. And, you know, surely when you talk about underperforming countries like Italy and Spain, they were forced to adopt the euro. So the Germans basically, forced them to, adopt an exchange rate that was uncompetitive. But if you go to Spain and Italy, you find there's lots of Mercedes cars that the Germans sold them.
Yeah.
And then, there's, quid pro quo here, surely.
Yeah.
So, that's my first question. The second question is, where are we going with the euro? Is the euro doomed based on what you've shown here?
On the first part of the question, Italy, when all of this was made, it was clear that the Italian political system also said to us in the fund, we are doing reforms now to get into the euro and to get into the EMU at the time that we could not otherwise do on our own. This straitjacket and this objective of becoming part of the Eurozone is helping us to do things that we could not do on our own. So they actually saw this as a helpful push in the back. The second thing I would say, you cannot call yourself a sovereign country and then at the same time say, the Germans made me do it. That is inconsistent. You cannot be a sovereign country and then claim that somebody else made you do something. And I take a very hard line, including with Mr. Varoufakis in my book on Greece. This just doesn't add up. You cannot. I think countries are sovereign countries. They need to think through what they do. If they don't agree, they have to say so until they have a satisfactory answer. You cannot blame somebody else. So I don't like that argument that the Germans made us do it. I have no sympathy for that. Where's the euro going? The euro is also a political project, the unification of Europe. There are many benefits attached to this. I think where we now have to watch and see what goes on, if they don't fix this and they are being inconsistent, as I suggest they could be, then the euro could simply explode at some point. We're a long way away from that because there are still reserves. They are helping each other. There's room to do it. But the fundamental problem is if they start playing around with the rules, then it'll come much quicker because nature does not permit you to do these things. You need to have a coherent plan. It needs to be mathematically consistent. If that is not the case, it's like a balloon. You put pressure on the balloon and you have an aneurysm coming out and you push that in and it'll come out somewhere else. So it's either the euro or it's growth or it's social peace or something is going to happen if they don't get this right. And this is one of the reasons why I think they're not going to meet the deadline because they're not close enough to come to an agreement. They really, I think, have to fix this. And they're really quiet about it. And one person I've talked with told me that they're so preoccupied by the war in Ukraine that they simply don't have the spare capacity to deal with all these problems at once. And they are, they have to, Ukraine is now priority number one. It was COVID before. That consumed all their oxygen. But it is obvious that this has to be fixed because they cannot go on like this. The debt will simply increase. But maybe inflation will be used as a... some countries have told me, we think it's a godsend because we're burning up all our debt. So they're already using the inflation tax to alleviate their accounts.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah, Rob.
I'm somewhat losing track of decades, but has there been any evidence over these decades of convergence?
Yes, I have evidence too, because my productivity numbers per country, I can clearly see that the ones that are growing somewhat faster are the new members. The members that came from the old Soviet Union are growing faster and are improving faster than the existing ones. But the speed at which this happens is much, much, much slower than 2070. This is wishful thinking. This takes a long time. But there's absolute convergence of standard of living, and they have been improving a lot since they came out of the former Soviet Union.
And sorry, does that convergence apply to deficit and debt ratios as well?
They came in with very little debt because countries of the old Soviet style had almost no debt. And they are building up some debt, but they're still, they tend to be some of the ones that are well below 60%. It's the old guard that have very high debt ratios, and they have pension systems that are. What is the problem for the new countries is migration. You know, I went to the Netherlands some time ago, and I just went to a pub to have lunch, and everybody spoke in English. And I asked them, well, where are you from? One was from Hungary, the other one was from Latvia, and the third one was from Lithuania. And you know the Polish plumbers and the Polish electricians, they're all coming to Western Europe. And it's really a huge number of people. And they used to go to the UK, but then when Brexit came, that got cut off. So the problem for those countries is out-migration. They're losing human capital, not yet in the critical debt stage.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering, well, I'm not a Brexiteer, but by now, obviously, the UK has left the Eurozone, or at least the EU. We're never part of the Eurozone. But there is talks, you know, when there will be a new government after the election, that maybe people want to rejoin in a decade. Yeah. Having seen all this, I'm not sure if I'm a big fan of rejoining. And I just wonder, the fact that Brexit happened, has that any effect on these, this evolution that you've just, shown, and thus maybe give these other opportunities to the UK as well? In other words, are Brexiteers maybe right for the wrong reasons?
Well, there will be some elements of Brexit that are right for the wrong reasons. I think that is correct. And you have a possibility of independent monetary policy and an exchange rate that you can use to as a buffer, as a stabilizing instrument. So the UK has maintained that. And there are some countries in the European Union that on purpose have not given up their own currency for this purpose. So there are some reasons why the UK must have some benefits of Brexit that may not yet be fully visible. I can tell you a selfish anecdote. I think it was bad for the Netherlands to use the UK, because the Netherlands and the UK are kind of in the Anglo-Saxon camp. I see the Netherlands and the UK politically and historically closer together. But the Netherlands is not big enough on its own to weigh up against France and Germany. So we used to have a triangle. Italy was not strong. France, Germany, and the UK were the three legs of the stool that had constructive fights, let me put it that way. The Netherlands is not big enough, in my view, to take over that role of the UK. So I'm looking at it from Washington, D.C., so I'm far away. But I always had the sense that if Brexit happens, that's a negative for the Netherlands. And now you have people in the Netherlands who say we need to ditch the exchange, the euro and switch over. And there's some pretty wild plans being cooked by some private people. You see this. And I think Brexit was not favorable for the Netherlands within the EU.
I think we can have one more. I'll just go to the back for one last question. It'll have to be.
Thanks. I've got lots of questions, but I'll just, the last thing you said just stimulated one final one, so I'll just stick with that. Maybe I'm a bit confused, but I was under the impression that Brexit was bad for everybody. And economically, it reduced growth in Britain. I think about 4% is a number I've been reading. But it had a bigger impact in Europe. And I'd have thought that the impact of Brexit is it's made all of the stuff you've been talking about worse for the Eurozone, never mind the impact it's had on Britain. Is that not right?
So Brexit or no Brexit, if I understand your question correctly, the Eurozone has to fix this. They cannot get around these inconsistencies. That has to be fixed.
No, I get that, but we were talking about Brexit just now. And you made reference as a side issue to the hidden potential benefits of Brexit. Well, I've seen no hints anywhere as to what they might be, but okay, they might exist. They're just hiding really well. But the main impact of Brexit was it was bad economically for Britain, but it was bad economically for the rest of Europe as well.
I would share that.
And that will have made all these difficulties worse because growth is less.
So we're doing what-if scenarios, which are never good scenarios to talk about because you can take any position you want. My sense, I like the economies of scale of a bigger common market. And in that sense, Europe has by no means exhausted its potential for economies of scale. But you need to think of a very different constellation. You need a federal European government that does activities that are better done at the federal level than at the local level. So in that sense, there are, I think, lots of potential economies of scale that Europe can harvest with or without the UK. But with the UK in it, the market is bigger. And there are more people that could benefit from it. So, I mean, I didn't like Brexit either. I was just making this comment that politically, in terms of influence, Brexit, I think, is bad for everyone in Europe, is probably bad for the UK. But the political relations within the EU, the Netherlands had a lot of support together with the UK because we are kindred souls to some extent. That is my perception. But again, be careful. I live in Washington, D.C. I'm not in the Netherlands, so maybe my brothers and sisters in the Netherlands don't agree with me, but that's the way I see it. I think the UK can have some benefits because you keep your currency, you have some flexibility to adjust. I'm sorry?
We always had a separate currency. I mean, Sweden is one of these countries that kept its own currency.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you are our first speaker from the swamp, Bob, so
yes.
you bring a unique perspective.
Yes. Well, I'm the swamp in D.C., I mean.
So we're going to have to wind up. Maybe people thought you were being a little bit biased about France, saying that you just can't run France. But I mean, it's not just a Dutchman who said that. Charles de Gaulle said the same thing. You remember he said that it was impossible to run a country with 246 cheeses.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily just a Dutch view from the Netherlands.
Yes.
So
anyway. I want to put this straight. You know, I've worked on Greece and I've worked sideways on Italy and France, and you know, these are magnificent countries, but they have serious political constraints to reach consensus, and that is impeding their ability to stick to the system. And then you need a different way of thinking about how can these countries function properly within a union. I think imposing limits on their debt and deficits, it's just not going to happen. You cannot force a sovereign country to do something that they cannot do. So in that sense, I take Macron and Draghi very seriously, and my assumption is they cannot really say, you know, write in the Financial Times, well, we're not going to do this. This is not possible for them. But they did it in an indirect way, a very convoluted way. And this, to me, is the message they really sent. So this is important.
we're going to have to wind up. Madeleine, thank you very much for chairing. This is Dutch Finance Night. So thank you for Dutch Finance tonight. And thank you, Bob. Come a long way. Thank you for especially coming from the Netherlands to visit us. I think we had a very good morning.
Well, I hope it was halfway interesting.
It was.
I think it is fascinating what's going on, but we have to watch it.
And I should say there's lots more in the book as well. I mean,
Yes,
there's lots, particularly about internal immigration and the drivers of internal immigration, which are really fascinating and not necessarily to do with economics, to do with something beyond economics. Anyway, that will have to end. Drinks are available at the back. Merchandise is available at the front. If you'd like to donate, feel free to do so. But between now and then, please thank Bob.
Thank you.